The ritual army. That is what I've chosen to call this episode. Why? Well, because I'm building the whole episode around John Laband's excellent chapter in his book Zulu Warriors. The chapter is called Sobhuza's Dream, and the chapter really is about the origins, organization, and functioning of the amabutfo or regiment system in Swaziland. The thing I found most beautiful and moving was the ritual elements of the army. The organizational elements are, of course, interesting in themselves, and its function as a tool of surplus labor extraction is interesting, but I think the unusual elements are the ritual elements, and so those are the elements I want to bring out. And this episode is primarily about the Swazi army, and to be honest with you, it's a great act of self-indulgence on my part. I really love Laband's chapter on Swazi history. I regard it, in fact, as the most beautiful and compact thing ever written on Swazi history. I still think Hilda Cooper's An African Aristocracy rank amongst the Swazi, and Philip Bonner's King's Commoners and Concessionaries are the best books on Swazi history, but the best chapter, the best compact thing ever, I think is John Laband, without a shadow of a doubt. I've read that chapter multiple times. I love the richness of the description and some of the details. I think it is deeply unfortunate that Laband never wrote a full book on Swazi history. I think his narrative ability exceeds that, for example, of a Philip Bonner. Bonner is great at the structural element, the archival extraction, but when it comes to drawing out a picturesque scene, Bonner doesn't even come close to Laband. So this is Laband's description, if you will, of how society slowly transformed and how we come to have the regiments in Swaziland. He writes, and I quote, "By the late 1870s, circumcision had been abandoned. Before being formed into a Labutfo, boys went through a tough training that prepared them for adult life as warriors. They started herding cattle when only 4 years old or so, and learned how to be entirely self-reliant on the open veldt, hunting animals for food." It reminds me a little bit of the Agoge. Their elders taught them to wrestle and stick fight, a dexterous skill mastered with many painful blows, and how to handle a spear. They became used to working together in military-like groups when hunting, herding, engaging in mock battles, and as they grew up, even in love-making parties. That's a very strange element, and I think there's a word for it. Hilda Cooper describes certain aspects of this, which is quite interesting. Every 5 years or so, when an age group was considered ready, the Ingwenyama formed it into a new Libutfo, under the command of one of their number who had come to his attention for his leadership qualities. A Libutfo consisted of about 8 companies, each one commanded by a member of the royal Dlamini clan. A company was made up of several squads of between 8 and 20 men who stood together in the dance and worked, drilled, and fought as a team. Every company and regiment had its own name, war cry, and dress decoration. The Ingwenyama was head of the army, but the actual commander-in-chief was usually a commoner, chosen for his military ability as well as his absolute loyalty. In fact, the greatest non-royal commander in all of Swazi history will emerge during this period of Sobhuza's reign from about 1820 to 1838-40. This is General Mkai Fagutse, who will mastermind the decisive Battle of Lubuya, in which the Zulu invasion of Swaziland will be checked. Now, the reason I caveat this with non-royal, it's because I think the greatest, probably tactical commander in all of Swazi history, if we exclude the great Mavuso Mswati II, who I think is indisputably the greatest commander in Swazi history, is a royal himself, and it is Mswati II's eldest son, Mbilini wa Mswati, who would famously he would famously rebel, and then he would leave when he lost the succession dispute when his father died, join the Zulus, and really show his tactical acumen during the Zulu-British War of 1879. And Mbilini wa Mswati, in part, loses out in the succession dispute because of his very obvious military abilities. When his father, Mswati II, dies, there is a regency period in which the young Lutfonga will be selected to be king, and because he's quite young, there's a regents, and then the great oligarchs of state like Malunge, Tandile, and Ndwandwe can exercise their control. And this group would form a cabal. And of course, that cabal does not want a very strong and able king to come to the throne so quickly. And so Mbili Nwamswati will lose out in this dispute because the interests ranged against him are simply too strong. Ironically, this is something that emerges throughout Swazi history. As much as people might not like it or be uncomfortable or might be made uncomfortable by the fact, a regency or oligarchy is always bad for the state. Centralized authority has historically been very good for the state. At any rate, I should go on. Laband goes on to say, the royal villages or barracks established across the kingdom served as rallying points to the amabutfo, from which they could mount raids against neighboring enemies. These villages also functioned as nodes of royal authority in outlying areas. Typically, a royal village was built in a great horseshoe of thatched huts encompassing the strongly palisaded cattle pen. At the top was the great hut of the member of the royal house in command, as well as the married quarters. The barracks of the Ema Jaha, which in singular is Lijaha or warriors, were in the wings on either side. When quartered in the royal villages, Ema Jaha served as the agricultural labor battalions for the king and his wives, for the Indlovukazi or the she-elephant, as the powerful queen mother was known, and for local chiefs. This is, by the way, one of those aspects of Swazi history that is brilliantly analyzed by Marxist and structuralist historians. As much as it might gall me, it is true. He goes on to say, work always began and ended with a hlehla or war dance in the cattle kraal or enclosure for livestock. The young men shouted out loud boasts and individuals flung themselves into athletic solos, all intended to attract the young women who are watching with an eye to future husbands. I love these moments because I'm such a big fan of history. I can't help but in idle moments wonder, what would it have been like, for example, to be General Mgai Fagutse, or indeed a young, ambitious member of the Libutfo? I like to sort of imagine myself in that period. And usually I think I might have been heroic, but the truth is, knowing my disposition, it would have been terrible. I am inclined towards sitting in a dark room with a screen where I have a book. I can take some notes. I have fun. I have 2 left feet. I'm horrible at dancing. And in other moments when I think about this, I think maybe I would have risen socially to sit on the inner council and spread wisdom. But of course, this is not true as well. To make it onto the inner council, just like how a respected Roman senator would have had to have served when he was younger in the legions and proven his courage, and then by doing that qualified to be an elder statesman, so too is it in Swazi history, or was it? To make it onto the inner council as a commoner, you have to have shown extraordinary ability and courage as a young man. I would not have made it onto the inner council. Laband continues, the Emabutfo also played a central role at the Ingwala, or the annual first fruit ceremony. Like the Maroteng paramount, the Swazi king ritually ensured the fertility of the kingdom, fortified it against its enemies, and renewed the Ingwenyama's bond with his people. He reviewed his amabutfo, who had gathered from every corner of the country to pass before him in emotive mass formations, singing and dancing. They wore festival hairdresses made of the streaming black feathers of the sagabula. By the way, I love the way that word sounds, the sagabula. Or long-tailed widow bird and white cowtails bound around their ankles, necks, and arms. Their leaders draped their loins in leopard skins. Of course, the main purpose of the Emabutfo was to go to war, and they were constantly pressuring the king to give them permission to prove their prowess against an external foe. They raided and exacted tribute for the ruling Dlamini elite, and were themselves rewarded with cattle and goods the Ingwenyama redistributed to them as foods and also as bride wealth when he gave the men of Elibutfo permission to take wives from a designated female age set several years their junior. In Zulu fashion, the men then sewed on a head string symbolizing their married status. I love this because I think I once encountered a paper in which it was shown that this is perhaps an invidious comparison, but ISIS or Daesh or whatever you want to call it, one of the ways it was very good at recruiting men was promising them wives. Nothing will incentivize young, virile men to throw themselves into battle like the prospect of marriage, especially in a society in which you have polygyny, and so women are a scarce commodity, if you will. He goes on to say, such largesse bound the Emajaha closely to the king, for their future wealth and promotion to positions of power in the state depended upon his favor. Yet, concentrated in their military villages, they were not easy to control. There was blatant rivalry between the regiments to excel, exacerbated by generational differences. Young, recently formed amabutfo envied the authority and the prestige of the older ones, some of whose members were widely celebrated warriors. They also resented the comfortable married state of the older Emajaha and their determination to keep the young women of their families out of the hands of the unmarried warriors. Sometimes then, it was desirable to go to war if only to prevent the amabutfo from turning on each other. Naturally, the younger amabutfo were always more anxious to go on campaign than their elders. The veterans had homes and families to lose, while the untried warriors needed the opportunity to display strength and courage and earn the praise of their superiors. These attitudes persisted on campaign, with the veterans regularly reining in the recklessness of the untried amabutfo. I think this is a very serious problem in the modern age. We have the problem of a gerontocracy. And because of the nature of credentialist society, it takes so long for younger men and women to prove themselves and therefore rise into positions of authority. It isn't necessarily that these are people without ability, but because the field of action is maybe not quite circumscribed, but the stakes are so low, credentialism so high, it takes such a long period. And by the time you get to prove yourself, you're in your 60s, your 80s, and you have this older group of people with very distinct interests, sometimes from a younger set in the population. Yeah. Anyways, I will go on. As in Bopedi, the decision to go to war required the Ingwenyama to consult senior princes and his inner council, and then to seek the approval of the Libandla, or General Assembly of Adult Males. If possible, the Swazi tried to minimize the disruptive effects of a campaign on ordinary life, and war was not normally declared until the crops had been harvested. Care was taken to keep a sufficiently large reserve of warriors at home to protect civilians while the army was away. Campaigns usually lasted no more than a month at most because of logistical problems. The king might send along some cattle for the road, but the Emajaha had to carry their provisions, staving off hunger by smoking cannabis and relentlessly foraging as they went. As the Swazi proverb has it, there is no case against an army. While the army was away on campaign, those left behind observed many taboos because it was believed that to fail to do so would subdue the warrior's strength and courage. This is where the beliefs, the ritual element starts to enter into the amabutfo, and we start to see it described brilliantly, I think, by Laband. Sexual infidelity by wives was considered particularly harmful, and heavy ropes were tied around their waists while their men were away. You can see why this taboo forms. I've watched some of the commentary, for example, on the Ukrainian war or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and some of the social dynamics playing out are disturbing, and I think throw a light on why these taboos start to emerge over time, particularly in these pre-literate societies. The army assembled preparatory to war at, by the way, this is probably my favorite passage. The army assembled preparatory to war at Hoho, the royal capital, below the Mtsimba Mountains. The national war doctors, who all belonged to the Gwebu clan and were forbidden to use their powers for civil wars, put the warriors through a series of rituals. These involved cutting off the foreleg of a live black bull and making it cavort in agony before the assembled warriors. The doctors then skinned and roasted the foreleg, sprinkled it with ritual medicines, and tossed it to the emajaha. They caught it in their teeth and ran about, passing it on, while ensuring that they never touched it with their hands. That done, the warriors lined up with shields touching. The war doctor stalked along their ranks, jabbing their shields with ritually potent roots and chanting incantations. The intention was to imbue the emajaha with strength and courage, to preserve them from mortal wounds, and to put confusing darkness before the eyes of their foes, so that they could not effectively fight back or escape. Warriors also ate an unborn calf ripped out of a slaughtered cow's womb. This was supposed to make them so slippery that their enemies would not be able to get their hands on them, and so that their weapons would slide harmlessly off. All these powerful medicines and ritual actions put warriors into a dangerous supernatural state from which they would have to be ritually cleansed after campaign if they were to re-enter normal society. This very much reminds me of the berserkers, I think, in Viking history, or at least in Viking mythology and fiction. You can imagine the sort of figure that such a warrior would have cut. There was a white bystander who recorded seeing one of these warriors, and I want to read out his description. He writes, "The head and face he almost conceals beneath the plumes of black ostrich feathers. In his right hand he bears his nobkiri and an asage, and on his left arm he wears his ox-hide shield, and in the hand a sheaf of spare asages. Around his neck he wears amulets and a hollow bone, which now and then he sounds. When marching to battle, he lowers his shield before him and knocks his knees against it. The sound of these shields against the knees of thousands is like the roar of the surf upon the beach." I love it. I love it. And then one of the elements Laband also describes is the culture this infused and what it did also to the Dlamini clan, who for intrepidity were at the very cutting edge of this amabutfo society. He writes, "The Swazi warrior's heroic culture embraced war as the supreme opportunity to prove his strength and courage and to gain recognition and reward. When the army marched out, scouts went ahead of it to make contact with the enemy. This particularly dangerous mission was usually assigned to members of the royal Dlamini clan, as they were presumed to be particularly intrepid. Their battle formations mirrored that of the Amazulu, with the young, reckless Emabutfo forming the swiftly encircling horns, while the solid veterans Emabutfo anchored at the center. Courageous death in battle was a special sort of death, the heroic, tragic culmination of manhood, a glorious sacrifice made for the greater good of the kingdom. So there was no mourning for the dead warrior. Emajaha, who had distinguished themselves, were dubbed heroes or emachawe, and thereafter, at festivals, mimed their glorious deeds in the leaping, solo dancing kukia before their comrades. Yet, because the violent taking of life exposed the killer to an evil, occult force named Lupalo, returning warriors who had drawn blood on campaign, along with the weapons they had wielded, had to undergo many cleansing rituals. Emakawa, in addition, received a tiku, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, a necklace of wooden pegs that proclaimed their heroic status, but also magically protected them from the dire consequences of homicide. Without these magical prophylactics, warriors would be exposed to the vengeful spirits of the slain, who would torment them in their dreams and infect them with an uncontrollable homicidal rage that would turn against others. It's interesting that there is almost an inchoate or unconscious appreciation that there is post-traumatic stress, that there is a sense of guilt and conscience. And of course, the way they conceptualize it is different. They think of it in terms of spirit, in terms of the supernatural. But the fact that there is some recognition, some social adaptation to, I guess, hundreds or decades of years of experience with this is, I think, interesting. And I think this sort of cultural milieu makes sense when you see how celebrated, at least in Swazi history, the figure of somebody like Mangibane Dlamini ends up being. I really love it because I was interested in why a Dlamini, for example, ends up being this last great warrior. And the fact that the Dlamini were the spearhead of the army sets that whole dynamic into context, for me at least. Laband goes on to say, on its return, a victorious army brought its plunder to lay before the king. The most sought after spoils were cattle, and the war doctors treated them ritually, with a lighted branch to dissuade them from returning home, as well as to destroy the lupalo they might be carrying. The king then redistributed the booty to his emajaha, the lion's share going to the proven warriors, the emakawe. It is notable that in their campaigns, the Amaswazi made little use of firearms. That was not because they were unable to lay their hands on them from traders, as did other African societies. Nor is it persuasive to suggest that their preferred raiding tactics of surprising a sleeping village at dawn made firearms unnecessary, and that such weapons were only of marginal effectiveness in taking a stronghold by storm. More likely, the cause lay in ingrained military culture they shared with the Amazulu and Amandebele. That is, the conviction that the only true way for Emakawe to prove their mettle was in ferocious hand-to-hand encounters with the enemy. That, ladies and gentlemen, are a few small excerpts from my favorite chapter on Swazi history. Really, that's all this episode is. Again, I think I mentioned that it is a great act of self-indulgence. I love that chapter so much, and I suggest anybody interested in Swazi history, you don't have to read Laband's whole book. Just open the book. You can see in the table of contents Sobhuza stream. Read that chapter. It is so beautifully written. It's so vivid. And it gives you such a deep appreciation of the cultural and ritual roots of the military culture of the 19th century in Swazi history. And I found that personally, after a few weeks of having a number of obligations I was not interested in leaning into, it gave me strength, fortified me. I just love reading a very good chapter. So I always enjoy that. That's all this episode is about. Thank you for tuning in. And like, subscribe, tune in to the next episode.